You are listening to Ukraine 242. We bring you interview subjects from all walks of life in wartime in Ukraine. Thanks to all our listeners around the world.
Welcome to Ukraine 242, a weekly program that features interviews with experts and key people on the ground in Ukraine and around the world responding to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm your host, Ursula Ruedenberg. Georgia is a small country at Russia's southern border with a population of 3 million people. In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia and still occupies 20% of Georgia's territory. On Tuesday, May 14th, the day this show is being produced, Georgia's ruling party in parliament, known as the Dream Party, passed a law known as the Foreign Agents Law. This law is seen as a threat to Georgia's aspirations to join the European Union and has become the catalyst for mass demonstrations in the country. In his article in the online newspaper Euromaidan Press, Zarkua writes, 2 decades after the Rose Revolution set Georgia on a pro-Western path, the country reaches a critical juncture as tens of thousands defend their European aspirations against the government's Russia-inspired Foreign Agents Law. Zarkua is a Georgian journalist and Georgia Correspondent at Eurasianet. He agreed to take some time away from the streets where he is covering the mass protests that are underway. He spoke to us from Tbilisi, Georgia's capital. Joining this conversation also is Alya Shandra, Executive Editor-in-Chief of Euromaidan Press, a free speech media group in Ukraine. Alya, as well as her other associates in this media group, were part of Ukraine's own massive popular revolution in 2014 that resulted in the change of Ukraine's government. Comparisons have been made between that pivotal Ukrainian uprising, known as the Euromaidan demonstrations or the Revolution of Dignity, and the mass demonstrations that are now happening in Georgia. Alya and Aka have agreed to discuss this historic moment for Georgia, to understand the similarities and differences between Georgia and Ukraine, and to understand the meaning of protest in post-Soviet states. We started out with Aka's description of what is happening right now in Georgia. Aka, you have just come from demonstrations that are happening this weekend in Tbilisi.
Yeah, yesterday was the biggest rallies in Tbilisi in years.
How long has this been going on? And explain the catalyst for these demonstrations, the so-called Russian law.
Rallies ongoing since early April.
Since April?
Yeah, as our government reintroduced a law of the foreign agents.
This law will affect civil society groups such as non-governmental organizations or nonprofit groups.
Yeah, and this law is pretty much resembles law which was adopted in the Russian Federation in 2012 when it effectively killed all the opposition and the different views.
The law says that if civil society groups receive more than 20% of their income from outside the country, they'll be required to register as, quote, organizations serving the interests of a foreign power, unquote.
When the Georgian government introduced this law is pretty much resembles Russian law.
This law is being brought forth by the ruling party of the Georgian parliament. Please give us a description of the Dream Party and the current political leadership in Georgia.
Georgia's ruling party came to power in 2012, and Bidzina Ivanishvili, which founder of Georgia's ruling party, is effectively a Russian oligarch. His fortune is like $5 or $6 million. And here I should mention that after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the rhetoric of our government really sharply changed and made a huge shift. In the first days, we saw from our Prime Minister declarations that Georgia will not align with the sanctions imposed on Russia, and it was pretty hostile rhetoric. But there is a lot of strange things here over the course of the last 2 years, because what we have seen after the Russia's full-scale invasion in Ukraine was that Georgian leadership started talking about global war party conspiracy. They don't name what country, they don't say what organizations are there or what kind of entities even that. But what they're saying is that this is a group of powerful people who wanted to drag Georgia into the war with Russia. And the Georgian government declined this invitation, and now they are being punished from the West. So that was the rhetoric which was preceded the introduction of this law of the foreign agents. first time. It was introduced in the spring of 2023. But here in Georgia, one of the biggest concerns among the population is our integration into Europe. 85% is for our continuation of our integration into Europe.
The European Union has said this law flaunts European values and that it would endanger Georgia's status as a candidate for entry into the European Union.
Yeah, so this law was met by heavy resistance from Georgia's civil society, Georgian media, and Georgian population. There was a week-long standoff in the streets of Tbilisi last year in March, and at the end of the week, the government decided to step back, and they made a promise that they will not introduce this law again anytime. But fast forward, the Georgian government have been able to acquire candidacy from European Union for membership. But what we are seeing now, they introduced the law again, and now we are seeing protest rallies. Even government didn't anticipate protest of such scale, because what we are seeing now in streets of Georgia is that protests are decentralized and autonomous. You go into the rally, you see one group of people, and you go like 100 meters away, you see different people. It's really, really autonomous, and no political party has control.
So you're saying it's bona fide popular movement?
Yeah, I mean, I saw different protests over the course of the last 20 years. I was heavily politicized kid in heavily politicized family, going to rallies from really young age. I mean, it's really, really a popular movement. And we are seeing that every layer of society somehow participates. People not related to politics. I mean, sportsmen are talking their mind about this law. Arts people talking about their minds this law. Today we saw that practically every major university student in Georgia said they will boycott this week, demanding from the government to roll back. I mean, of course, political parties are participating in the process as well, but they are not organizers. No political party has control over the process, what we are seeing in the streets of Tbilisi right now. And the reason for it, I guess, is that these events and this initiative of Georgian Dream Party, in the whole context, what we saw in the last 2 years, population perceives this event as an attack of Georgia's sovereignty and the country's path towards European integration.
People feel strongly.
Yeah,
in it.
And it's the strongest nerve of Georgia's population right now. If we can look back to the last 20 years, only thing which had held this country together as then one nation was this one purpose of integration into NATO, into European Union, and finally get rid of Russia's influence. Over the course of Georgia's independence, it was the main thing, and especially last 20 years, because before that in 90s, in reality, we had no centralized government. It was a failed state.
It was a what state?
It was a failed state.
A failed state.
In 90s, it was a failed state, involved in civil wars, criminal gangs, influence, all the other things. After Rose Revolution, as country consolidated in some ways, and we had some centralized power, and the state was able to collect taxes, these kind of things. But here in Georgia, a main nerve center of Georgia's independence and Georgia's population was European integration. And now
into the EU
and into NATO. That was the main thing, and that's why people coming out and protest now. And we haven't seen apex of this process yet.
So, Aka, I'm curious what your integration means to Georgia.
This is Alya Shandra speaking.
Because during the Euromaidan Revolution, it was also centered around the topic of moving closer to Europe and Russia's attempts to stop us from moving closer to Europe. And, you know, your integration for Ukraine, it's not only a political symbol. It's a symbol of how we would like life to be. It's a symbol of a better, dignified life that we would like to be living. And we see this example in developed democracies, and the developed democracies that are closest to us, they're in the EU, right? So it's not only about political alignment, but it's about the life that we think would be best for our society, right? In Ukraine, for instance, Euromaidan, it has a second name, the Revolution of Dignity, because as we were protesting over these months, we were trying to understand what does Euro-integration mean to us, and we understood that it's having a functional democracy, and that means dignity for all the people here, as opposed to this post-Soviet state where there is a lack of dignity. So I'm just curious how Georgians see it.
I totally agree with Yeah, I think it's really parallel experiences between Ukraine and Georgia, and I think it's really difficult for Western Europeans to understand experience of countries colonized by Russia, what they're been going through.
Can you describe that a little bit?
So Georgia is located, as you know, on the southern border of Russia. Russia first annexed Georgia in beginning of 19th century. Probably you have heard about Five-Day War in August of 2008, the so-called Five-Day War, and Georgia has two regions occupied by Russia. So for Georgians, European integration means getting rid of Russia's influence. It means security and safety. When you have a neighbor like Russia, the only way we can imagine our security is to be a member of greater alliance with greater mighty who can defend you, because we are a small country of 3 million people and Russia is 145 million country armed with nuclear weapons. So the only way for us to be free and at peace is to be with European Union and with NATO. This is the perception of Georgia's population for the last 30 years.
When Alya was talking about the Revolution of Dignity, she was defining the issue not only in international security, but also in terms of personal experience.
What is our relations with European countries? But huge amount of Georgian citizens are now going to work in European countries. They're working there, somehow feeding their families here. And a lot of Georgians have also experienced living in Russia. They know what Russia is. They know their personal experience, what it's like to live in Russia without your liberties, without ability to speak for your mind in an open manner. In 2006, Russia's government introduced harsh laws to punish then Georgia's government, and they deported nearly 10,000 Georgian citizens living in Russia by cattle cars, like to transport cows. So we know there will be no dignity as well, not as safety, not as security, if we will be living under Russia. If we talk in terms of population feelings, it's dignity, it's security, and they perceive that Russia will not be stopped unless we are somehow fully integrated in this European project. What choice do we have? We have Russia, which has occupied 20% of Georgia's country. We have Russia, which started the full-scale genocidal war against Ukraine. It was one more time we saw with our eyes that this country is not a country of 21st century. This is Russian Empire, which wants to fight for its ideologies, crazy conspiracies in which Vladimir Putin lives. We saw it in Crimea annexation in 2014 and then a war in eastern Ukraine. And after that, 2022, and you see that any hope that Russia one day could be a different country with whom you can coexist somehow peacefully, maintaining your dignity, is not possible. We saw that the only way Russia perceives their neighbors is as subservient vassal states at best. And this feeling to become as far as possible from Russia, it's really stayed strong, especially the last 2 years.
You are listening to Ukraine 242. I'm your host, Ursula Ruedenberg. This is a conversation with Aka Zarkua, a Georgian journalist and Georgia correspondent at Eurasianet, and Ukrainian journalist Alya Shandra, editor-in-chief of Euromaidan Press in Kyiv. We are discussing the ongoing mass protests that are happening in Georgia, responding to a divisive law just passed by the Georgian parliament that critics call the Russian law and say that it will threaten civil liberties. Central to the protests is that this law could threaten Georgia's process of joining the European Union. Alya, I'm struck by the similarities between what you expressed as a Ukrainian and how Aka is describing the feelings of most Georgians, especially his description of how Georgians want to integrate into Europe to move away from Russian colonization of their country.
Ukraine also has a very long history of colonization by Russia. Our history is actually even longer. But right now, what Aka said about Russia seeing its neighbors only as subservient vassals, I think is absolutely true. And for Ukrainians, it resonates a lot. But Aka, what I would like to ask is that it seems that despite this very strong anti-Russia feeling of Georgian population, somehow this Georgian dream got elected. and they were able to introduce this law being carried out. So I would have expected Georgia to be very anti-Russian because of the 2008 occupation. But as it seems to me, over these years, Russia has been influencing somehow Georgian society and attempting to draw it back into influence. Could you tell us a little bit about this? And would you say it has succeeded, this plan to draw back in? Because I think it's a plan that Russia wanted to use on Ukraine when in 2014 it occupied chunks of eastern Ukraine. We were thinking about what was the end game here. Does Russia actually think that it can draw Ukraine back to its sphere of influence by occupying chunks of Ukraine? I mean, it has made Ukraine very anti-Russian. And we've seen that the story in Georgia is playing out and moving closer to Russia. So could you maybe explain how this very strong anti-Russian feeling after the occupation of 2008 and how it evolved into the situation that we have now with this very pro-Russian law, pro-Russian statements and actions by politicians who were lawfully elected by the Georgian population?
On the population level, on society level, in Georgia, we have such strong anti-Russian sentiments, and in the last couple of years in the government, you can see talking points of Russian propagandists. Georgia Dream Party is really based on one man's Bidzina Ivanishvili, one man's money. It's not imaginable to imagine Georgian Dream Party surviving without Bidzina Ivanishvili. Over the course of this last 12 years, he really built a really strong vertical of power, should I say, use this Russian term. And it is a multifaceted scheme of how he was able to control the situation through these resources of authoritarian repression. Bidzina Ivanishvili has this huge resource of monopolized employees, and the government controls these people who work for government. And in the elections, they are going and voting for Georgian Dream Government. He controls all the main financial chains. I mean, big business is aligned with Bidzina Ivanishvili. He controls all the judges, all the levels of the courts. He controls every ministerial post. And he is the boss. He is on the top of this pyramid. And over the last 10 years, we have seen non-stop government propaganda. They are acting as, in Orwell's Animal Farm, all the time telling people that if I will not be here, if not us, you will be beaten, tortured, and thrown into prison. And they are playing this polarization card all the time. They are saying there is no alternative to us. So they are speaking about Bidzina Ivanishvili as godlike figure who can always defeat enemies. So the main reason for this contradiction between anti-Russian sentiments of population and pro-Russian politics of government is successful in suppressing alternatives.
Okay. Now, my understanding is that the president of Georgia said that she would veto these Kremlin-style laws.
Yeah.
So how can she do that if everything is so much under the control of Ivanishvili?
The president has a largely ceremonial role. She has no any executive power. I mean, she can technically veto, but parliamentary majority can override this veto easily.
Why is she not afraid if there's so much power?
I mean, she was independent candidate, but ruling party decided to back her candidacy. But then cracks emerged on different issues, because what we saw from our president was that she made statements about that we have no any other alternative to Euro integration process, and she really strongly condemned Russia's invasion in Ukraine. And this gap between the president and the government really grew apart over the course of last 2 years. And now she has, 1 year left in her term. I mean, her term is coming to an end. And now she considers these actions from the Georgian Dream Party as treason. She will label the Georgian Dream Party, which is official name of ruling party, she labeled as Russian Dream. And she has said that he will veto this law, but technically parliamentary majority can easily override this veto.
Okay. A parallel that comes to mind as you were describing how the Georgian Dream and Ivanishvili managed to seize power. This is a clear parallel with Euromaidan, because leading up to the Euromaidan Revolution, Yanukovych and his party region, they also concentrated power. And so we're seeing this parallel with growing authoritarianism, decline in democracy and freedom of democracy. And because of that, the people in power can make choices that the population does not support. And this is exactly what happened with Euromaidan, and now in Georgia we're seeing this. So before such major protests, we can expect that a decline in democracy happened and that somebody seized power for themselves. Yeah, I was wondering, Aka, over all of these years, I know that Russia had used the topic of Euromaidan to scare populations in post-Soviet republics. Like, if you dare to protest, this is what will happen to you. Russia will punish you, yeah. If you protest, there will be a punishment, and the punishment is Russian invasion. Was that analogy made in Georgia after Euromaidan, and how do Georgians view Euromaidan?
Yeah, I mean, first, how should I say, really attention-deserving signs about today's Georgian Dream Party. They were hugely skeptical. It doesn't matter, everything going to be the same. But what is really alarming here is that we are seeing that Georgian Dream Party officials now using Euromaidan as the tool of frightening people. Bidzina Ivanishvili, he made the really big speech, 20-minute speech, which is rare thing because he's really enigmatic, closed guy. And he made his program speech, should I say, at the end of the April. And what he said was that Euromaidan protest, Revolution of Dignity, was organized and executed by foreign agents in Ukraine. Ivanishvili said that himself, that this was all organized by foreign powers, somewhere in the West, foreign powers. And what we saw in Ukraine was that destruction, people becoming poorer and that kind of thing. And Maidan is not way for Georgia, and he also said that Georgia is not Yanukovych's Ukraine. Meaning of that phrase was that he will not allow change of government through a popular protest movement.
They're saying that the result in Ukraine was that Ukraine was subverted by Western influence. And then they're saying that in the Georgian case, the prime minister will not flee. He will not abdicate his power. They will lead in and enforce totalitarian force if necessary. So they're separating themselves from what happened in Ukraine.
Yeah, they totally separating what's happened in Ukraine. They see Euromaidan as this revolution of dignity, as hostile. They see this as a threat to their rule. And what we are seeing is that they are really willing to escalate. They are willing to beat people up, and orchestrated campaign by Georgian Dream Party beating up different oppositional figures. We see shaming posters of different opposition figures, writing on them that this is traitors of country. Then a couple of days ago, Georgian Internal Ministry had a briefing, and they demonstrated on the video how police cracks down on protest demonstrators in the West. France, some footage from Netherlands, some footage from USA. And what they said was that our approach is more humane. And if this protest will not stop and this protest movement will grow in pace, we will use the same attitude and same methods they are using. So that's a clear message from them that they are willing to escalate and they are really not willing to step back and reconsider their calculation. We saw shaming posters. Before that, we saw orchestrated telephone calls campaign from foreign numbers, and hundreds of people received insulting and threatening calls, saying that you should not go out to protest this law.
Okay, so this begs the question, why are people defying this? Why are they showing up?
Now we have the feeling of momentum. I think there is some parallel here also with Revolution of Dignity. As far as I know, one of the breaking points of Euromaidan process was beating of students.
Oh, like roughly 1 million people gathered here.
Yeah, here they're coming out on the streets. It's mainly young generation, and they are seeing as what's happening right now as their generational battle.
And they're not afraid.
I mean, yesterday's rally was preceded by this campaign I told you about. These phone calls, beating up, shaming posters. And what we saw after this escalation and intimidation from the government, even bigger numbers turned out on the streets.
I think it's important to stop a minute about this myth that Russia is spreading about Euromaidan and popular protests, because Russia succeeded in pushing the myth that Euromaidan was inspired somehow by foreign powers. So basically the idea is that it's all a big plot by Western powers to actually destroy Ukraine and through Ukraine, of course, destroy Russia. So what is important to note here in this conspiracy is that it denies agency to people to actually protest for a better life. It's founded on a notion of a very undemocratic society where one party actually holds power in the state, authoritarian usurper of power in the state. It actually controls civic groups, controls media to create this mirage of a democracy. But there is no democracy. In this situation, there cannot be any people who protest on their own. So it defies the idea that they have ideals for which they're willing to risk their life and livelihood, where protests cannot just happen by themselves, where people cannot just want to change something for the better in their state and voluntarily go out and spend their time and defy threats and intimidation and even the threat of jail and death. And what we see is this big clash of ideas of how a state should function. And whereas in Georgia and Ukraine, people actually went on the streets to risk their time, money, livelihoods, even their lives, because of an ideal of a dignified life.
I don't know. I mean, I'm pretty optimistic that somehow we will prevail in this situation. What I'm trying to say is that Ivanishvili not as in good position as he was about 2 months ago. There is some big challenges for his role, and he will be forced by his situation and his previous choices to make more and more and more mistakes.
Okay. Well, I have indulged in keeping you up almost up until midnight.
Now, I have to go to the protest.
So the protests are going on now at midnight?
Like 7 o'clock, police will start to clean up.
Wow.
Thank you, Alya and Ursula. Thank you for your interest. We don't have to lose our hope. And I have to say that this is only possible because of Ukrainian resistance and heroism we are seeing over the course of last 2 years. I know how difficult it has been, and I know that it's going to be difficult for us some time ahead also. But I want to wish you Ukrainian courage, because I know the situation is difficult. I want to say thank you and say that I'm praying for your fastest victory as possible.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, and have a good night. You've been listening to Ukraine 242. I've been your host, Ursula Ruedenberg, and I have been fortunate to be speaking with Aka Zarkua, Georgia Correspondent at Eurasianet, and Alya Shandra, Editor-in-Chief of Euromaidan Press. Aka was calling from Tbilisi, Georgia, and Alya was in Kyiv, Ukraine. Euromaidan Press is an online English-language free-speech Ukrainian media group and can be found at euromaidanpress.com. That's EUROMAIDAN press.com. Aka's name is spelled AKAZARKUA, and if you Google that, it will take you to his article in the Euromaidan Press called From Rose Revolution to Russian Dream, Georgia at Breaking Point with Pivotal Pro-EU Protests. I appreciate how much time and thought they gave to recording this show with me. Easy questions for me to ask, much harder to be living through it. And until next time, I thank you for listening to Ukraine 242.